Hey guys, what is up? SuperKmanrocks here, and we're here for my LCK Week 9 overview and analysis. Usually here, I would say power rankings as well, but no power rankings at the end of this one. Gonna leave it a little bit ambiguous as we move into the final week of the season. This is the last week of the LCK regular season. We will be getting our last games to determine the standings going into playoffs, and then of course tomorrow, actually, I will be releasing a playoff primer video that's going to be going over all 6 of the teams that are in playoffs and then giving you guys my mock bracket. So no power rankings. I'm going to be saving that for a full video tomorrow. Included in that video is also going to be my MVP pick and the rest of my all-pro votes, and so be sure to check that one out. But today, we're here to talk about the final week of the season here in the LCK, and there was definitely some interesting action. Top 6 is already decided. We know who's going to be making the playoffs, but we don't know what order they're going to be going in, and there's definitely a lot that those teams could show. Even some of the bottom teams are still a little bit interesting and are definitely not playing to lose. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. Of course, let me know down in the comment section below what you guys thought of this final week here in the LCK and what you think is going to happen when we start moving into playoffs. What teams are maybe overperforming right now that you think might not perform as well once we get to playoff time, and what teams are sneaky contenders to make it to the finals or perhaps even dethrone the kings of the LCK right now in T1. I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts and opinions down below, but let's go ahead and talk about it, starting with day number 1. And we kick day number 1 off with a matchup between the Kwangdong Freecs and DRX. KDF picking up another win here, and honestly, they've been on fire lately. They've been a really good team over the last few weeks, beating teams that they have absolutely no right being in the game with. A lot of development coming out from some of the players that maybe weren't playing as well. I'm not going to say that their one roster change completely changed everything, but a lot of the players that were playing well before have been stepping up, and then a lot of the players that weren't playing well before have been playing a lot better. Just a lot of positives for KDF overall. My player of the series here in this first series of the week is going to go to Dudu in the top lane, and I'll be honest, I'm super high on him. I genuinely think he is one of the upper half top laners in the LCK. You know, I'd have to think about that a bit more, but he's certainly within the conversation of being somewhere around top 5 in terms of top laners in the LCK so far this year. He's been really good, in my opinion. He's been the best player for this KDF team in 2023. We'll talk about Bulldog. I think Bulldog will be the better player, like, next split and the split after, and etc., etc. Like, his upside, I think, is greater, but the inconsistency that mid has gotten over the course of the year just leads me to say, like, Dudu has been one of the guys that has most impressed me coming out of KDF. The Jace game in Game 2, not exactly great, but some awesome Cassante games coming out in Games 1 and 3. He was easily the most valuable player on KDF in this series, dominating Rascal in the top lane. Credit to Rascal, he played ridiculously aggressive, but just wasn't going to be able to keep up. KDF did a good job shutting him down, and Dudu in particular did a good job generating his own lead. And so really, really good stuff coming out from him. Bulldog obviously is still really good on this team. I still like the upside for Bulldog. Maybe not as much as other people as we've talked about in the past, but he really has started to prove me wrong in that regard. He probably is a little bit more than someone like Karis, right? Like I was comparing him to at the beginning of the year, but you know, it's still going to be interesting to see if this team does eventually get some talent around him, if he is going to be able to step up, if he is going to be able to be that guy that can carry a team. I'm not exactly sold that he can be that yet, but obviously there's a lot of time for him to grow. He's the youngest player in the LCK, and he's only going to get better. He's had a really good split, and he was good in this series as well. But the big change for this team, in my opinion, going from what they were like at the beginning and in the middle of the season, where they were probably, you know, one of, if not the worst team in the entire league, to now where it feels like, you know, if they had had a better opening parts of the year, they may have contended for a playoff spot. I think the big difference there is the bot lane, where the bot lane was easily, without a doubt, the worst bot lane in the LCK to kick off the year. It just hasn't been that over the last few weeks. They've actually been pretty good. Taiyun and Moham have definitely been more of a positive. Moham coming in, honestly, has looked really good. Moham was someone who wasn't really on my radar. Every kind of chance that he had gotten in the LCK before, even last year, just really hadn't been all that good, and he wasn't even good this year when he got brought in at the beginning of the year. He got replaced with June because Taiyun and June had chemistry together, but June was awful for this team, so they end up bringing Moham back in, and then he has games like the Seraphine game in Game 3 that is really, really fun to watch, and honestly, it kind of convinces me to keep giving him a shot. He's been really good over the past 2 weeks, and I would imagine you're going to keep rolling with that. Taiyun has looked a lot better. I think they've realized that taking him off of some of these more hyper carry oriented picks and trying to play to him. It's just not the style that they want to do to win games, and putting him on something like Ashe Seraphine in the bot lane, that's big. Caitlyn Lux, I think, has been really big for this team. Those are the kinds of things I'm going to see this team go to a little bit more over the course of the year, but Dudu, Bulldog, definitely the standouts. The solo laners are the headliners for KDF, and it's definitely helped them move up in the standings. As for DRX on the other side, it's not the worst loss in the world. Again, KDF is probably the best team that is out of the top 6 right now, but DRX still able to take a game here in game number 2, and they looked okay doing it. One of the players that I do want to give a nice shout out to is Juhan in the jungle. He is absolutely the answer here. I know that Krako has had some good games here or there, but consistency-wise, Juhan has just been so much better in the jungle, and I would expect this team to continuously go to him. Now, obviously, DRX is one of those orgs that you just never know what direction they're actually going to go. Juhan has looked like the better jungler in the past on this team and gotten benched right before, major tournaments before, so I don't really know what direction they want to go in. Obviously, that time, for Pioshik, it worked out, but we'll see what they end up wanting to do in summer. Obviously, spring's a dead season for them at this point. But at least Juhan's looking good. I think he adds a lot more aggression and a lot more proactivity to this team that they desperately need. And I think that Dekdom in that same vein is actually a really good AD carry. I feel really bad for him because his positioning has been really spot on this split. I don't think his aggression has necessarily been there. He's played really passive, but he is making like almost no mistakes over the course of the year, which is very hard to do on a team that is just bad, especially when your support and your lane is just awful, and that's kind of what we'll talk about here. Beryl is going to get dead of the series again. It's just Beryl. Like, this was your typical Beryl series. He played way too over-aggressive without any sort of pressure on the map to be able to back it up, and he just died over and over again, basically for no reason. This is just kind of what's going to happen with Beryl. He knows one play style. The team is either in the game or they're not in the game, and he's either able to get it off or he's not. Rascal was also, kind of a little too much, I would say, in my opinion. The Fiora game in game 1 was a little bit too active, but for the most part, he still was at least fun to watch. He was trying to make plays. It was maybe just, too many plays. Rascal and Beryl kind of in the same boat in that regard. Fate counterpicked himself in game number 3, which is kind of funny, but, Juhan and Dekdom are two pieces that you can take away from this split, saying like, well, they're not really that bad. Pieces that we can move forward with. I'm not exactly sure about everybody else on this team, but there's enough talent that makes me think that they're probably just going to run it back and see what happens. I just don't know if that's really going to solve any problems. Very similar to what Nongshim did last year. As for KDF on the other side, it's unfortunate that this team is eliminated from playoffs because I genuinely think that they might be better than Liiv SANDBOX. They are a good team that knows how to play. Like, they figured out their macro, which was their biggest problem at the beginning of the year, was they had no idea how to go into the mid to late game because they didn't have an AD carry. And it's very difficult to do that without an AD carry, but I think support has been upgraded so much that Taiyun feels a lot more comfortable playing these early game comps, generating leads, going into the mid game, and then Dudu and Bulldog are really good team fighters. Yoonjae, by that regard, is also a really good team fighter, and so KDF has kind of figured out a formula, a strategy to win games. Unfortunately, it's just not going to matter all that much now in spring. Moving on to the second series of day number 1 now, and this one was something that I was really interested to see. It's two teams that have honestly definitely been on the downswing as of recent. One a little bit more than the other, but neither really playing the best league they've played all year. We had Liiv SANDBOX taking on BRION, and Liiv SANDBOX does get the job done. Super important for them. They've lost basically all of the momentum that they generated towards the beginning part of the season. Anybody who's watched the channel over the last few weeks knows I'm pretty out on SANDBOX as a contender right now. They're probably the worst team going into playoffs. They're a team that I think really benefited from just looking really good at the beginning of the year and then maybe hasn't really kept up that pace the entire season, but I don't want to take too much away from SANDBOX because there are a lot of players on this team that I still really like and that I still think have proven a lot to me over the course of the season, none more so than my favorite player on the team, someone who has, I think, officially become one of the channel darlings. I think you could bring him up now when you talk about the players that I'm just ridiculously high on. Kayle, down in the support position. He is awesome. He's such a good player. I don't know how you play Nautilus like this. It almost feels like unfair to watch this game 2 come out because he is... I didn't know you could bend the hooks. I didn't know you could just go around things. I didn't know you could layer them in between things. Like, it is insane how he was able to hit all of these Nautilus hooks. That's not a small hitbox. That thing will latch onto anything around it, and he is perfectly weaving it in between all of these minions, all of the other champions to hit exactly the target that he needs to hit basically at every moment. He's just ridiculously good. His mechanics are ridiculously underrated, but we all know what he's known for, and that's just always being in the right place at the right time. He has a wonderful sense of where to be on the map. His macro game is extraordinary, and, from what we know about Liiv SANDBOX, he's a huge part of their comms, and so Really, really like Kale as a player. I think he is genuinely one of the best supports in the entire world. There are a lot of freaking good supports in the LCK this year. All Pro is going to be absolutely miserable with Keria, with Kellen, with Lahens, Kale. Like at least one of these guys is going to have to miss out on All Pro. And that is super unfortunate, but all of them have been playing ridiculously well, and Kale definitely is included in that upper echelon. Other players to talk about here, Willer and Bertle on the top side of the map. I've been really high on Bertle in particular over the course of the year. I think he's another player that has generally gone under the radar in terms of top laners. Top lane is just not something that has received a lot of attention from LCK fans over the year because there just isn't a lot of top lane games this year in the LCK, right? There aren't a lot of games where teams are actually playing through the top side of the map and then translating that somewhere else. We saw it a bit at the beginning of the season, but ever since teams have really started fighting for some of those standing spots, a lot of teams have started playing for their bot lane, for their mid lane, right? As they should. It's the strongest part of the meta, but Bertle's one of the few top laners that I think has generally gotten resources from his team, like, pretty consistently. And I think he's done really well with it. He had another good series here. He was better than Morgan, and Morgan's not a pushover. He's an LCK caliber top laner, and I think Bertle was pretty solid here. Willer, honestly, is really good. I think he is properly rated. He's the player that I think has gotten the most positive reception, I would say, overall for SANDBOX this year. He's been really good. I do think that he is properly rated by the community. He is a mid-tier jungler in the LCK, which is great considering the fact that he was on the bench the entirety of last year. For him to come in and immediately be like a mid-tier with high-tier upside in the jungle, I think is really good. Closer is incredibly mechanically talented. Really like to see him get better at picks like Talia. That was stuff that he struggled with last year. And then Envy, he looked good. I think he got a little bit too much credit for how the series went, but he was still really, really good, especially on that Aphelios in Game 2. Overall, a lot of positives for SANDBOX. Really not a lot of negatives for me to chill out for them. Kale was especially great. Closer was awesome in Game 1 and in Game 2, and then Bertle and Willer, I think, are really solid as a duo, especially. They work incredibly well together, so SANDBOX looking pretty good. As for BRION on the other side, this team has lost it. Like, whatever they had at the beginning of the year, whatever mojo, voodoo that they had at the beginning of the year, it's gone now. I dropped them down to 9 a couple of weeks ago before they really started their full descent, and that has looked phenomenal in hindsight. I mean, this team very well could be the worst team in the entire league outside of Nongshim in the last couple of weeks, and that does not bode well for them moving into summer, but let's kind of talk about why I think they're getting there. I think a lot of these players ended up just crashing back down to earth. A lot of them had really great starts to the year that were a little bit unprecedented for their talent levels. In particular, I'm talking Umti, I'm talking Henna, and I'm talking Effort, who were all really good, I would say, or not really good, they were all pretty good towards the start of the year. Umti in particular was awesome in week 1 when that team went 2-0. Henna and Effort were really good for most of the year. They were really solid through half of the season, but all of them have really kind of taken their foot off of the gas, and they just haven't been nearly as good recently. Umti in particular, who's going to get my dud of the series here. He just loses pressure so quickly in the early game. It's actually astounding. I know he's the main shot caller here on Bro. I know he shares some duties with Effort and Karis and everybody, but he's the main shot caller in the early game, and it is so consistent that Bro loses the early game that it just frustrates me, right? Even when he picks something like Lee Sin into Sejuani, which theoretically should be something that you can punish early. You should be able to create a lot of action. You should be able to speed up the pacing of the game. He's just not able to do that. It feels like he takes way too long to get online. He is smart and is a good team fighter in the back half of games, but if you're going to pick Lee Sin, that can't really be your playstyle. You need to be able to survive in the early game, and that's not really something that Bro has been able to do at all this year. Morgan kind of got outplayed in the top lane. Effort in particular had a bad Nami game in game number 2. There were just a lot of negatives coming out from Bro. I don't think that they are a good team. I think they've shown that over the course of the last few weeks. At times, they were looking like the best of the rest. You know, that 7th place team that KDF has kind of taken over where it's like, well, maybe, if things were a little different, this team could make playoffs. But that's just not the case for Bro anymore. They've definitely revealed their true colors, and unfortunately for Bro fans, their true colors are just not a very good team. As for SANDBOX on the other side, this team is in playoffs. They are one of the top 6, and this win is nice, but it certainly doesn't do a lot to dissuade my fears about this team going into the playoffs in spring here. They just have not been able to deal with any of the better teams in the league, and those are the only ones that you're going to be playing once you get into that playoff bracket. And so SANDBOX still has a lot that they have to do left, but I guess if you're going to start somewhere, it's got to be with a nice win over a team that you should beat, right? And then moving on to day number 2 here in week 9 of the LCK, and day 2 kicked us off with probably the most interesting matchup of the week. My number 1 and 2 teams in my power rankings going head to head. We had T1 taking on Dplus KIA. And of course T1 gets the job done. I know it's 1-2. I know this is supposed to be close. But the difference between T1 and every other team in the LCK is still massive, and that got proven more so in this series than in almost any other series that we have seen so far this year. Credit to T1, man. They have just done absolutely everything right up until this point this year. There really is almost no complaints that I can give to this team. In fact, I don't think there are any. The only complaint that I can give is that they don't often draft real enough, right? They will often skill check their opponents by taking crazy, weird, like, nonsensical drafts and beating them anyways, and so, you know, maybe they're not as practiced as some of these other teams on, like, actual meta picks, but this series was meta. They picked only meta against DK because they knew they were a real opponent. They wanted to put him out of their misery quickly, and so it's basically just meta coming out from T1, and they dominate in this game. Really, really fun stuff coming out from them. Player of the series is always so hard on T1 because all of them deserve it. Like, there is never a series where I'm like, you know, some of these players didn't play all that well, but they kind of got carried by one person. It's all 5 of them. Every single week, it's all 5 of them that deserve player of the series. And this one, I'm going to give it to Faker in the mid lane for that LeBlanc game. He just plays LeBlanc at such a different level from anybody else in the world. We talk about some of these players that are like assassin mains, you know, people like Certus in the LEC, people like Cream, or even like Zeka in the LCK, right? Faker's LeBlanc is not comparable. It is not comparable to anybody else in the entire world. What he's able to do with that clone, how he's able to micromanage the clone while he's also still fighting, is absolutely absurd. I've never seen anyone be able to do that at even remotely that kind of level, and Faker does it so consistently, and he's done it for so many years. It's just an absolute treat watching him play this champion in pro play. I think, you know, he's probably the greatest LeBlanc of all time. I don't think I'm making a grand statement by saying that, and he showed that off again here in game number 2. Not to say the Ari game in game 1 was bad. Again, every single player on T1 absolutely deserves all of the credit that they're going to get in this game. Faker, you know, definitely included in that. But, you know, he's making a case to be in the MVP conversation. Obviously, you've got, you know, 2 or 3 other teammates on this team that are also in the MVP conversation, so it's a little bit difficult to make your case, but I think you can make a really solid argument, at least in my opinion, that Faker has probably been the second best player on T1 so far in 2023, and that is just absolutely absurd. It is genuinely one of the best years he has ever had in the regular season. That's awesome. KIA, again, I mean, the MVP frontrunner for, you know, 99% of voters, I would imagine, was awesome again in the series, going up against probably the second best support in the LCK in Kellen, and just kind of making him look foolish, you know, actually picking legitimate supports this game and not Kalista and not Caitlyn, and not all these other, you know, marksmen that they end up pulling out in the bot lane. He played Thresh, he played Lux, and he played him at a ridiculously high level. It's not like this is a surprise. It's not like KIA is someone who burst onto the scene with crazy picks, and then once he gets found out, he's not going to be able to play anymore. KIA has been a top support for so many years. In my opinion, he was one of the best supports in the world last year when everybody was super out on him. That's certainly one of my takes that I think has aged particularly well. I got a ton of pushback in my top 20 players at Worlds, I think, for putting KIA as the second best support. People were mad. Like, people were like, he does not deserve to be there. Come on, man. Like, it's KIA, and I think he's showing off again why he deserves to be there, not only, you know, on standard picks, but on everything that he ends up pulling out. Gumayushi's been awesome. The spotlight's kind of been stolen away from him because his bot lane partner has been so eclectic over the course of the year, but he's probably been the best AD carry in the LCK. Pretty insane year from him. Zeus was dominant in this game. They were constantly sending 3-4 people top lane to try and attack this Gnar, and he was just kiting them out with mini Gnar, dealing a ridiculous amount of damage, building full damage, by the way, on Gnar. Zeus is just that much better than everybody he's played against. Look at his GD at 15. It's absolutely absurd. And then Owner is easily the best jungler in the LCK right now. I don't even think it's really all that up for debate. T1 is just that dominant. They have everyone clicking, and there's really not a lot of negatives I can give. As for DK on the other side, this team was white hot going into the series, but T1 is the ultimate fire extinguisher in the LCK. They will put out any sort of momentum that you are able to generate pretty much as soon as you're able to generate it, and that's kind of the case for DK. They just weren't all that relevant in this series. They got put out of their misery pretty quickly. A lot of players that were kind of disappointing, but for me, I'm going to give dud of the series to Kana up in the top lane. I know his scoreline doesn't look nearly as bad as maybe some of the other players on this team like Canyon, or even someone like Showmaker, but I felt like Kana's contributions to this game were so limited, were so non-existent, that to me, he was by far the least influential player in the entire series. Zeus obliterated him in the top lane, and you know, it wasn't really all that close. He was up like 20, 25 CS every game. That's even with Kana having relatively decent farm, but he just couldn't withstand any sort of pressure in the top lane. DK actually gave him a lot of resources in this series, and he genuinely just wasn't able to do anything with it. Just wasn't a great series coming out from Kana, but I don't really blame him. Again, going into Zeus is really difficult to do, and it's not like the rest of the team actually played well. Canyon lost pressure really early on in both games on the Lee Sin. That's just something you can't really get away with. Showmaker didn't have any pressure in the mid lane because Jungle was losing, and he wasn't a champion that could actually take over. Deft and Kellen weren't nearly as good as Gumayusi and Keria. Nobody on DK's side was able to perform up to the level that they needed to in the series, and that's okay. Like, I know that's crazy to say. I know it's like, oh, they're the number 2 team and they got blown out, and that's okay, but that really is the difference of where T1 is at right now. DK is going to be walking out of the series kind of feeling probably like this was expected, because it kind of was. T1's just not a team that is very touchable right now, and DK still has a very reasonable chance of getting second in the regular season. They still have to take care of business towards the back half of the week in another incredibly crucial game for them, but unfortunately, Series 1 does not go their way. As for T1 on the other side, they're just awesome, 16-1. They're hopefully going to end the season 17-1. You know, a lot of these guys are making the case for MVP. You could make a really solid argument the entire team is first-team All-Pro. It's actually absurd what this team has been able to accomplish and how dominant they've been over the course of the regular season. It just leads me to believe that nobody in this region, maybe even in the world, is on their level. Then moving on to our second series of day number 2 here, and it is a good one. 2 teams that are in the playoffs as of right now, maybe one a little bit more credible than the other. We had Hanwha Liiv Esports taking on Gen.G, and Gen.G does get the job done here. They are able to pick up a win. I was talking about this last week. The LCK very much is a top 1, and then the next 3. Really, the top 4 teams are all really competitive right now. You know, Gen.G, DK, KT, they're all kind of in that same little bubble, I would say, in terms of skill level. Hanwha Liiv, Liiv, SANDBOX, they might be in the playoffs, but they're not necessarily on the same level as maybe some of the teams above them, and that was definitely shown off in this series. I've got some thoughts, some things that I might want to defend, some things that I might want to, you know, heavily criticize on the side of Hanwha Liiv, but let's talk about Gen.G first and foremost. My player of the series was honestly a really tough decision here. I think everybody on Gen.G played really well. I think Doran crushed the top lane matchup. Super fun games, I guess I should say, from him in this series. I thought Paze and Delight in the bot lane were sensational. Delight in particular on that Lulu in game 2 was really setting up a lot of the plays that were ending up happening. He was really right place, right time, pretty much the entire game. Really impressive stuff, but my player of the series is going to go to Chovy in the mid lane, and I know some people might be a little frustrated with that, so let me defend it a bit. Mid lane K'Sante's hard to play, and he was up like 40 CS. Like, that's just kind of the difference that Chovy makes over almost any other mid in the game. You can talk about some of the flaws that Chovy has, and I've talked about them on the channel. Obviously, when this team is losing, when Chovy is the only one ahead on the team, he often takes it upon himself to be the one that has to win the game, and what that really means to him is sometimes he'll go into the side lane for way too long and try to farm, try to get strong, because he knows he needs to get there. From ahead, though, Chovy is super proactive, he is super difficult to deal with, and is probably, I'm not going to say probably, is the most mechanically talented player in the world. I can't even think of a single player that I would put on his level when he is playing at his absolute best, and I think Game 2 was a wonderful example of that. K'Sante mid is hard to play, especially into something like Ahri, which generally speaking should just have the push and should move around the map as freely as possible, but Chovy was exerting so much pressure in the mid lane simply by being that much better than Zeka across these 2 games that there was almost nothing that Zeka could actually do to keep himself in line with Chovy in this one. Super impressive performance. I expect Chovy to be able to put out a lot of these when it comes to playoff time. He was awesome in the playoffs last year. People kind of forget how good he was in the playoffs last year. He was leaps and bounds better than almost every other mid laner in the region in the playoffs. I know that there's this weird narrative that's associated with people who haven't won Worlds that they are somehow choke artists. It's just not the case when it comes to Chovy, and I don't think a lot of people would agree with that either. And so, yeah, I expect Chovy to keep leveling up and just get right to where he needs to be by the time playoff time rolls around. Obviously, the other players on Gen.G that really performed well in the series, I already talked about Paze and Delight. Paze looks awesome on 2 games of Zeri. His positioning's really good. He's really aggressive, but really for me, when you're looking at a bot lane member of, you know, Gen.G in this series to stand out, it's Delight. It was a really good Leona game in game 1. It was a really good Lulu game in game 2. He was probably the more interesting member of the bot lane in this one, which might be the first time that I've said that all year long. I've actually been pretty neutral on Delight for most of the year. He's not really been in the conversation for one of the better supports in the league, even though Paze has been in the conversation for one of the better ADs in the league. And I think that's just kind of my thoughts on Gen.G, is that Paze really is the better member of this bot lane duo, but Delight has definitely improved so much from what he was over the past couple of years on BRION. It's really nice to see him get into an organization and get with some players that could really unlock a lot of the playstyles that he likes to play. And I think he did a good job here. And then Doran in the top lane was also the other one that I thought was really, really good in this game, and honestly was just overall positive for Gen.G. I think everybody on the team looked good because this was a little bit of a stomp, especially game 1, but even game 2, definitely in favor of Gen.G. They were the better team by a lot in this series. As for Hanwha on the other side, well, I'm out. I've already said that I'm out on SANDBOX. I might be even more out on Hanwha Life. This was disastrous, and this is just kind of par for the course. We talked about Hanwha getting tested over the back half of the split. They had gotten a big run of teams right in the middle that were all really easy to beat, and then they were going to be going through the gauntlet towards the back half, and unfortunately for them, they have failed the gauntlet. They have not been able to withstand a lot of the pressure that these teams have been able to put up to them, and a lot of their players are regressing because of it, most notably their mid laner, Zeka. Now, I do want to say, before we jump into any sort of conversation, Zeka was awful in this series. I'm not going to try and defend that. He was really bad. The Sylas game in game 1 wasn't very good, but it was the Ahri game in game 2 that was particularly disgusting to watch. He had 0 prio into a K'Sante mid. He wasn't able to get out on the map. He wasn't able to CC anybody. He was missing charms. He wasn't dealing damage. It was a really bad Ahri game, right? He was getting caught out. There wasn't really a lot of takeaways, if any, positive ones for Zeka in that game. But on the flip side, I'm seeing a lot of conversation very similar to some players that we talked about in my LPL recap yesterday. We're seeing a lot of conversation shift to Zeka has not been good in 2023, and that's just where I draw the line. Like, again, we can talk about how Zeka has not been very good over the past 2 weeks, but to say that those 2 weeks represent the 9 weeks of the LCK is just preposterous. This is the exact same thing that happened last year to Zeka, where he would be good enough. Like, yes, he hasn't had, like, crazy breakout carry performances, but let's remember for the first half of this season, he was this team's best player when Viper and Life and Klid and Kingen were all not playing super well. Zeka was the one hanging them, like directly holding them up on the string, and without him, this team would have collapsed way before, but he was doing really good, and yeah, maybe over the middle of the split, a lot of the pressure got transferred to Viper, and it got transferred to Klid, and a lot of them started to play a lot better against these weaker teams. Great, Zeka wasn't playing bad during that stretch. Yes, I'm agreeing with you. Zeka's had a poor last 2 weeks of the season. It's not been particularly good, but Zeka has always been a very streaky player. DRX was very streaky last year in general. Him and Pioshik were incredibly streaky. Barrow, we know, is streaky. That's carried over to Hanwha Life, and I, for one, am not surprised. This is not an indication that Zeka is not going to be able to perform in the playoffs. That is the point I want to make here, is that a couple of bad weeks for Zeka is certainly not an indication that he is not the player that he was last year. For the most part this year, he has been good on a team that has, at different points in time, let him down. And so, I don't know what's going to happen in playoffs for Hanwha. I think Viper was fine in this series. He was really the only one that was defendable at all. Klid picked Vi in game number 1 and then never went bot lane in a Draven Ashe lane, and it made me lose my mind. Kingen got kind of beat up in the top lane. Hanwha's definitely showing its flaws. They don't really have a good structure of macro. Viper needs to be mechanically skilled enough to be able to carry games in the late game, and Life's not really pushing the lane forward early, and so they don't really generate early leads unless Klid gets super far ahead, which is just not an efficient way to win games. And so, yes, the flaws in Hanwha Life have, kind of come out, but I don't think this team is, like, unredeemable. I think that there are positive qualities to how they have played the game this year, and if they can bring out those positive qualities just a bit more often than they bring out whatever the hell it was in this game, I still think that this team can win. It's just maybe not likely. As for Gen.G on the other side, this is good. The later game in this week is going to be the one that matters. Them versus DK is going to decide who gets second place. Most likely, obviously, there are still some ways that KT can get second place, but Gen.G versus DK is going to be an incredibly important series, and this, for them, I assume, was just a warm-up for that one. And then moving on to our first series of day number 3 here, and it's an interesting one between the Kwangdong Freecs and KT Rolster. And no surprise to a lot of people, KT is able to pick up the 2-0 series win. And that's the final match of KDF's regular season. They are technically the first team to be done here in the LCK, as they are not in the playoffs, and their regular season has officially ended at a 6-12 record. Certainly not too bad. Honestly, a lot better than I gave them credit for and a lot better than I expected from them. But let's talk about KT Rolster first and foremost, because this is a really important win for them. Their standings are certainly not locked by any means. With Gen.G and DK playing each other later in the week, them winning this and potentially The next series against DRX as well would slot them into the number 3 seed instead of the number 4 seed. Now that doesn't really matter, but I guess if you would rather play one of the bottom teams, that might be something that you can control. And so for KT Rolster, it's a nice win here, and they were the better team. They didn't necessarily show it in all of game number 2, because KDF was certainly in this, and honestly, they probably should have won this game, but old KDF had to rear its head, and their macro had to be pretty bad. But shout out to KT Rolster, they were able to close it out. Player of the series was a really easy choice for me in this one. It's going to go to Lehens in the support position. Obviously, that Blitzcrank game in game 1 was great, but it's really the Lux game in game 2 that really stands out and just kind of reignites the idea that Lehens is one of the best supports in the entire world. He's kind of shown it, I would say, for a majority of the split, but this is one of those performances that, like, really locks it in my head that he's a really good player, right? He's not just a support. He is a really good support. And all the expectations that I, had for him going into the year about how, a player like him and aiming just wouldn't, mesh well together because of their playstyle differences, all of that has gone away. They have meshed together really well. The entirety of KT has really worked together well, and they have shown that off. Aiming was also really good in this series. The Jinx in game 1 is a lot of fun to watch. It's always good to see aiming on a hyper carry. That's kind of what he's known for. It's kind of what he does best. But even the Caitlyn in game 2, that early aggression, like, that's the kind of pick that aiming just would not have been able to play 2 years ago. So it's really good to see the evolution that he has had as a player. I think playing with someone like Lehens has helped him out a lot. Obviously, Life last year, he had a great chemistry with, but at some point, you got to start giving him the credit. He has gotten a lot better. He has gotten a lot more consistent, and I think that's really the big improvement that he has made. The talent has always been there, but it's always been a little bit up and down for him on whether or not the talent actually comes out in each individual series. It feels like over the past year and a half, he has really locked it in and become the AD carry that everyone kind of wanted him to be for many years. BDD is a legit MVP candidate. I say that in the knowledge that MVP is kind of a foregone conclusion at this point in the season, but in a regular season, he's an MVP candidate. He's in the top 3, in my opinion, with a couple of other T1 players, but he's been really, really good this year. He's been the central focus of KT Rolster, even though aiming and Lehens have kind of taken over, I would say, a bit in the second half of the season. And topside's been good too. I think Cuz in their wins looks good, in their losses maybe looks a little bit lost at times, and then Keen is really good. It's just top lane doesn't really matter all that much right now, so it's hard to talk about him unless they devote a lot of resources up there. But generally speaking, KT Rolster is just a good team. There's really not a lot of negatives to go over with them. They're just incredibly solid. As for KDF on the other side, their season is now over. It's definitely a frustrating way to end off the year with a loss here, but honestly, 6-12, you'll absolutely take that. I had them at number 10 in my preseason power rankings. Obviously, they have outperformed that. They are clearly the best of the rest in the LCK right now in terms of the teams that did not end up making the playoffs, and that's a pretty surefire statement to make. Obviously, Bulldog kind of made a name for himself over the course of the year as a nice up-and-coming mid laner here in the LCK, but Dudu in the top lane, another player that I really like, he didn't have a very good series, but we're going to ignore that. My dud of the series, unfortunately, does bring out some of the problems that we were talking about earlier. I know I was saying Taiyun and Moham had been a little bit better in the last couple of weeks ever since KDF kind of found their little shtick there, how to play macro in the mid to late game, but this series kind of got them exploited. They're actually going up against a team that knows how to pressure in the early game, and Taiyun and Moham were not ready to accept that kind of pressure. Taiyun in particular is going to get my dud of the series. That Jinx game in game 2 was absolutely horrendous. I mean, consistently walking into aggro, consistently getting yourself into bad positions, and getting in trouble. There's really just not a lot of good here coming out from Taiyun, and that's unfortunate. I think Moham also had a pretty poor series. The Leona just did not work out in game number 2, and this felt like more of them crashing back down to earth. I hate to say that because that's a term I really do dislike using. I like to see when players can, go above and beyond the expectations that I and many others had for them going into the year, but it does seem like bot lane is still going to be a weakness for KDF. It was not a long-term answer to see them kind of solidify towards the back half of the split, but I still think the solo lanes are good. Youngjae has shown good things. I don't think he's been nearly consistent enough for me to consider him like a core piece to this KDF team, but the solo laners are, in my opinion, they are really good going into summer, and it's going to be interesting to see what this team wants to do. If they do want to contend for playoffs, I think it's actually a viable thought process and something that isn't completely out of the realm of possibility. I do think you would need a new bot lane, though. That's really where I think things come in. Moham, I think maybe you might want to, play around with. He's been okay over the back half of the split, but he was awful when he was in at the beginning part, and he's never really shown anything for long periods of time at the LCK level, but I'm super out on Taiyun. I just don't think he's going to be an ADC at this level, at least in his current form. Obviously, maybe he finds some developments, maybe he gets better over the next year, but in his current form, I just don't see him as an LCK AD carry at the moment. He's kind of been abused by basically everybody he has played against. KDF still, though, at the very least, 6-12, you'll take it. I mean, close to 500, and this team is right on the cusp of being relatively good. It's going to be interesting to see if they take that leap in summer. As for KT Rolster on the other side, this team is good. They are a top team in the LCK. There is a very real world in which they are one of the two teams heading to MSI to represent the LCK. The consistency really seems to, kind of have developed over the course of the split. There are still question marks. I still want to see them, consistently win some best of fives against some really good teams, but they've basically shown me absolutely everything that they can up until this point, and, I'm really impressed with KT Rolster in 2023. And then moving on to our second series of day number 3 here, and it's a battle of the bottom teams. In my opinion, the two worst teams in the league going head-to-head here, as we had NS RedForce taking on BRION, and NS RedForce picks up their second series win of the season in one of their finals games of the season. Unbelievable here. We do have a substitution to kind of talk about here for NS. Fiesta in the mid lane is out. Call Me is in, and that is something that we will be talking about a lot in this series, because Call Me is actually going to be getting my player of the series on the side of NS. Fiesta certainly had not been having a good time at the LCK level over the course of the year. I had talked pretty extensively about how I thought he was probably the worst player in the LCK in 2023, which is unfortunate because I loved him in the Challengers League. He was one of the players I was most looking forward to seeing play. Him and Sylvie had a great connection down there, and I thought that they were going to be able to make it translate to the LCK, but obviously it's a different beast at this level. You gotta be able to adapt very quickly in order to survive, and unfortunately it just didn't feel like Fiesta was able to do that. But Call Me comes in, gets a little bit of an easy matchup for his first series, and takes advantage of it. He looks really good, specifically on the Veigar in game number 2. He's really good on the Taliyah in game number 1, but it's that second game that really pushes him over the edge. They clearly wanted to make him feel comfortable, and Veigar is one of those champions where if you can execute him at a high level, he's not only going to be useful in lane because he really stops a lot of the pressure coming in from the other side of the map. There's not really a lot you can do to a Veigar as long as he plays relatively safe, and there's really not a lot that the enemy can do either. Like if you're going to be playing Sylas, you're not going to be able to shove and roam because Veigar's going to be able to trap you in that lane, and if you let him scale up, he's going to deal a lot of damage in the late game, and so not really a lot that you can do in that matchup. And then you can execute in team fights really, really well. That Event Horizon is one of the strongest abilities in the game if used at a proper way. If you're able to get flashes constantly, if you're able to reposition AD carries in a specific manner on the backline, it's one of those abilities that really can change the trajectory of an entire team fight, basically with just one press of a button. And so Call Me playing that game number 2 really well, I think was really impressive stuff. Obviously, you're going to play him for the final series of the year, but with this performance, it might be something to look into to see, play him throughout summer as well. This was probably the best performance that NS has gotten out of their mid laner all year long, and it was in his first game, and so that's certainly something to keep in mind. I do think Vital and Peter played really well in that same vein. Peter, in particular, was really fun to watch. Obviously, he's really good at these enchanters. He was really good at them last year, too. That was something that I always talked about, but he's good on the engagers as well. Really like Xayah and Rakan for these two in particular. It feels like Xayah is in a really good state right now. It allows a lot of these players to be aggressive in the early game while also not feeling like they have to make plays in the mid game in order to survive like the late game hyper carries that they're going into. Xayah can still team fight at a pretty high level. But really, for me, it's the Rakan that turns this lane into something that is incredibly brutal to play into. Rakan just has so much agency over the game right now, not only in lane, but out of lane. However you want to play him, he has so many tools to be able to get in, get out, stay in, whatever you need to do, stick onto a backliner. He has tools to be able to do basically whatever you want out of the support position, and when you're a really good support, you can play him at a high level. This was probably Peter's best game of the year, and it's unfortunate that it comes right at the time that Call Me plays well, because I think both of them probably deserved player of the series. I can only give it to one, though, and unfortunately, it's going to go to the mid laner. Everybody else was good, too. Vital played his role well. Sylvie and Din on the top side were solid, but it really was the mid laner and the support to me that really stood out as, like, the players for NS in this series. As for Bro on the other side, I mean, disaster way to end your split. Your split is now over. You're 4-14, and you got, 3 of those wins in the first 3 weeks of the season? That kind of goes to show how bad this team was over the second half of the stretch, but I don't really expect things to turn around, unfortunately, unless this team makes some sweeping roster changes. I don't think that Henna and Effort in the bot lane are good enough to be able to keep up with other LCK teams. As much as I like Karis mechanically, he's not consistent enough to be able to do anything, and he showed in this series that he's kind of lost a little bit of the killer instinct that he had over the middle part of the split. And then Umti is just not it in the jungle. I hate to say it. I know people really like Umti. I'm not one of them. I think he's just a bottom tier jungler in the LCK. Morgan is really the only player on this team that I think has any sort of semblance of LCK pedigree. And he was the worst player in this series. He's going to get my dud of the series. 2 games of Renekton. That's Morgan, baby. He's going to pull out Renekton even when it's a really bad matchup into something like Darius, and he's going to get punished for it, and that's kind of what happened here. Again, Morgan, for the most part, has kind of grown out of this weak side top laner role that he was given on HLE, many, many years ago, but he still is going to have some games where he's not as good. He's not one of the best top laners in the region. He's just a serviceable top laner. I do think he took a little bit of a step back in 2023 compared to what he was in 2022, but I would still probably stick with him going into summer. Everybody else on this team, in my opinion, completely fair game to be replaced. If you can find someone better, if you have someone better in-house, pull the trigger on them, because I don't think any of these guys are untouchable, and I certainly don't think any of them are going to be pushing you towards a playoff berth, which at the end of the day has to be the goal for BRION. Even if it's not like top 4, just if you can get even close to top 6, hell, if you can finish the regular season in 7th place, that's a bonus compared to what you were this split. And so definitely some decisions to be made for Bro, but for Nongshim, I don't really know what direction you go in. You got a lot of young players. You probably just let them grow together. You've had half a split to kind of realize who you like, who you don't. I think Call Me is a good addition. We'll see how he plays later in the week as well, because that's obviously going to matter a lot. But in the opening series here for him, it looked pretty darn good. Now moving on to day number 4, and day 4 is a super important one when it comes to the standings of the LCK going into playoffs. All 4 teams participating today are playoff teams looking to figure out where they're going to land, and we're kicking that off with a battle for 5th place between Liiv SANDBOX and Hanwha Liiv Esports. And HLE does pick up the win. They bring the losing streak to a screeching halt, and they desperately needed to do that in this one. But I have to say, both teams walking out of this looking really bad. Like, there is no winner here. I know HLE's walking out of this with a W, but it's not a clean W. It's certainly not a good W, and this did not make me feel better about either team heading into playoffs, because they already felt very like they were walking on thin ice heading into the playoffs, but now I feel that tenfold after this series. Let's go ahead and talk about it. HLE takes game number 1 pretty handily. Zeka's really good on the Vigar. They're able to generate a really nice lead. Viper does a good job in the late game on the Xayah. There's really not a lot to talk about. Just a good overall win for HLE. Then game 2, HLE has completely in the bag. This looks like an easy 2-0 win. And then mistake after mistake after mistake after mistake. And then all of a sudden, oh, I guess Envy's really strong on the Jinx. And, we can actually win this game. Kale's hitting some hooks on the Thresh. It's overall just going kind of well, and Liiv SANDBOX is able to take it. Game number 3, complete fiesta. I mean, this was an NA game if I've ever seen one. This is what the LCS looked like at the end of last week, where it's just teams running it down in the mid lane, hoping to out-mechanic the other team. Hanwha Liiv is the more talented team, and so they were able to come out on top in that kind of fiesta style, but it certainly does not make me feel that much better about this team heading into playoffs. There are some positives to take away. The first major one, and really like the main one in this series for me, is going to be Zeka in the mid lane. Was talking a bit earlier in the week about how he seems to be getting a lot of the flack for HLE's disappearance over the second half of the split. And while I agree he certainly hasn't been great, he's not been one of the best mid laners in the league or anything like that, I don't think he's the same kind of problem that, other people will make him out to be. And I think this series kind of proves that to be the case. That Ahri in game 3 was phenomenal. He was the biggest piece in game 1 on the Vigar, and he certainly was the only player with a brain in game number 3 on the Ahri. Those charms made it very difficult for a super fed Samira, by the way, on Envy to actually play the game. He would immediately get hit with Charm and then just die in team fights, and there's really not a lot that SANDBOX could actually do about that, because Zeka was always either on the flank, he was coming from creative angles. He was by far the best player in the game. It is very different to see mid-level Ahris and top-level Ahris play. This was a top-level Ahri performance coming out from Zeka, and honestly, I was very, very impressed by it, but he wasn't the only player on the team to play well. I think a lot of people are going to point to Viper here in the bot lane, and yes, I agree Viper was really good, especially in that game 3 on the Varus. However, I want to see the killer instinct come back from him. That's something that I think he has been missing a bit of since coming over to the LCK. I think a lot of his mechanics have returned, a lot of his ability to fight and to coordinate with his team have returned, but this is still different than EDG Viper. EDG Viper was willing to fight basically at any moment. He was always looking to generate his own leads, and then when his team would play to him, he felt like he had the confidence to basically go for any play. That Viper is not translated over to HLE. I think a lot of that is trust in the teammates around him, but you know, if that Viper can unlock and come out of his shell, I think this team can get to at least kind of close to where they want to go, but you're really going to rely on a lot of the rest of the players to play that well. Glid's really good at smiting, but outside of that, he's made some very questionable decisions. Kingan's just meh on the top side, and Liiv certainly has not been the support that I think a lot of people wanted him to be, coming off of a really good year on KT Rolster, and so you're just hoping and praying that Hanwha Liiv can get their shit together, but this certainly was not an indication that that is going to be happening anytime soon. As for SANDBOX on the other side, we just talked about how Hanwha squeaked their way to a victory. You were the team that lost to them, and so that's not a particularly good look. You probably shouldn't have won Game 2. This probably should have been a 2-0 sweep, but the other team kind of gifted you that opportunity in Game 3, and then you throw it away by playing really poorly. There's really not a lot of good that I can say about this team. I think some of the positives, Envy was able to get ahead. He did nothing with the gold, but he was able to get ahead on the Jinx. He was kind of the one that kind of saved the game in Game 2, and he was super fed on the Samira in Game number 3, but go watch that game. I don't think he did damage past like 25 minutes. I don't think anything happened in that game for Envy, and it's just disappointing. I hate to say, like, I told you so, but this is an I told you so moment, I think. Envy is just not one of those players that's going to be good enough to carry this team to playoffs. He was really strong at the start of the year, but I was just waiting for the fall off, and we've gotten there. I think Envy has dropped back down to being one of the bottom tier LCK AD carries right now, and it's disappointing, but it just is the truth. He has no idea what to do with all the gold that is generated from him by Willer playing really well, and Kale playing really well, quite frankly, in this series, but Envy wasn't the only one who played bad. That's why he's not done of the series. Done of the series is going to go to Closer in the mid lane, and I know people are really high on Closer. And again, I'm going to get a lot of flack for this, just like I got a lot of flack last year, just like I got a lot of flack at the beginning of the season, but another year of Closer starting off incredibly hot with a couple of really good games in the first couple weeks of the season, and then completely disappearing for the second half. Now, yes, I do want to talk about, you know, him having a good first half. It shows that he has the ability to be a player that can compete at that level. For the first couple of weeks of the season, he was genuinely looking like an all-pro caliber LCK mid, and there just aren't a lot of players who can say that at any point. It shows that he does have the upside, but I'm tired of waiting for him to put it together. It feels like year after year after year we have gotten this kind of performance from Closer. He needs to start stepping it up when it matters the most. If he just completely disappears in playoffs, I'm going to be so disappointed, because really that's kind of the direction he's headed in right now. He was just nothing in this series. A lot of bad decisions on the Sylas in Game 3. Even in the game that they won, his Ahri really wasn't all that clean. The difference between his in Game 2 and Zeka's in Game 3 was definitely noticeable. And then Bertle, a player that I do like. Not a great series from him, but again, it's kind of an ARAM and you're playing Jace, and so you're going to get exploited a little bit more than normal. I would say Bertle, outside of, Bertle, Willer, and Kale are all really good. I am a little bit concerned about Closer and Envy, though, especially heading into playoffs, but generally speaking, this team has already outperformed expectations. I had them as the number 8 team heading into the season, and they finished in 6th. That's really not all that bad, considering the fact that they're probably going to get absolutely destroyed and swept in the first round. It's just kind of happenstance. They at least were able to make the playoffs, and I think that there is a positive to take away from that. As for HLE on the other side, yes, you won, but what did it cost? It cost you looking like a moron even in winning, so hopefully this team figures it out eventually. I'm not hanging my hat on that, but I'm going to be honest, both of these teams kind of walking out of this series looking like the bottom 2 teams in the playoffs and pretty easy competition for the first round. And then moving on to our second series of day number 4, and this is the one I and a lot of other people were really looking forward to this week. This is the matchup for second place, 2 teams that have kind of been linked together the entire split so far. We had Gen.G taking on Dplus KIA, and Gen.G picks up a massive win here. This is not what I expected to happen. I was talking about this earlier in the week, but DK is really a team that's been on the rise as of recent. Showmaker in particular has been playing some of the best League of Legends he's played in quite a long time in the last few weeks in the LCK. Deft and Kellen have looked great. Canyon's been a little up and down, but the ups are still there. And Khan has been an upgrade in the top lane to what they had last year in Nuguri. And so you're kind of looking at DK as the biggest threat to be able to compete with T1. Not so much after this series. This was Gen.G first and foremost. Now, second game, a little bit back and forth, but for the most part, Gen.G was just kind of the better team across both of these games. Not exactly the most clinical, not exactly the most action-packed, but this was a Gen.G series nonetheless. Let's go ahead and talk about it. My player of the series, a lot of people, I think, are going to want to give this to Chovy in the mid lane, and I totally understand that. That Yone game in Game 2 was really good, but for a lot of good moments, he actually balanced it out with a lot of moments that kept DK in the game, especially in that game number 2. So my player of the series is going to go to Delight in the support position. He was really good in this series. That Rakan game in game number 1, really, really, really good. Rakan is just one of those champions right now who, surprise, surprise, is really, really, really good. I've been saying it for quite a while on this channel. Xayah Rakan in general are really strong when they are good, and they're pretty good right now, but Rakan specifically is just in a really good spot. He basically offers everything you want, and a player like Delight is absolutely going to take advantage of that. This might have been the most shine that he has gotten all split long. This is probably his best week of the season, and it's come at a perfect time for Gen.G to be able to pick up the 2-0 this week. Love him on the Rakan, love him on Leona. Obviously, he's going to favor a lot of these engagers. That's what he did on Bro over the past couple of years. He just didn't have a lot of players that were going to be good enough at following up on that in the past few years to be able to make the most of it. Now he's got Chovy. Now he's got Pays. He's got players on the team that can now absolutely follow up with a lot of what he wants to do. And so he's looking a lot better. I'm not necessarily saying he's one of the best supports in the entire world like I think some of the other LCK supports are, but Delight's certainly not a pushover. He has earned his spot here on this Gen.G team, which was definitely a question mark going into the year. But obviously, Chovy's the other player you got to talk about. Some of those Yone ults are just absolutely ridiculous. Mechanically speaking, he's just the best Yone in the world, at least at the pro level. You just don't see players play him like this all that often. To come and play a series like this after he had the Cassante series earlier this week, it just goes to show you how ridiculous Chovy is. Of course, he's dominating basically every early game mid lane statistic, as he always will for the end of time. This is one of those splits where Chovy is going to go under the radar, but he's had a Chovy split. Like, it's not like he's not been one of the best mid laners in the region. There's just a lot of good mid laners in the LCK right now, and unfortunately, it just feels like he gets a little lost in the shuffle. Peanut was really good. Maokai's a champion that has always suited him really well, and that continues here. Doran gets 2 games of Jason to Kennen. I think that's generally speaking going to be fine for him. And like I said, Pays was really good at following up. I really like them bringing out the Ziggs Yone combo. I think that's something that's actually very dangerous to play into, and it very much worked in game number 2. But overall, even if it was a little slow, even if it wasn't a little action-packed, there was a lot of good to take away here from Gen.G, even if game 2 could have been a little bit more clinical. As for DK on the other side, you've got to be frustrated not being able to pick up the series win here, not being able to pick up a game in this series. You definitely wanted to see them at least compete with a team like Gen.G, but I do need to point this out. Historically speaking, DK and Damwon have done really poorly into Gen.G as an organization. They've kind of been a little bit of their kryptonites. DK's had an easier time dealing with T1 historically than they have with Gen.G. It's just one of those matchups that maybe they just aren't as good at. But there are a couple players that definitely stand out for not being as good in this series. I think you can definitely look at the bot lane. This is one of the worst series they've had all year long. They just were not difference makers really at all, and I think that might be the first time that I've said that in 2023, but dud of the series, pretty easily going to go to Canyon for me. Just way too aggro and not really creating a lot for his team. It really does feel like Canyon sometimes borders on the idea of generating leads for his team or playing the game for himself, and obviously we know he can do the former. We know that he can be a really good supportive jungler. We know he can enable the rest of his teammates to look really good, but some of these games it just feels like he's running it down trying to generate kills for himself without really a second thought in his brain. That happened in game 1 for sure, and it kind of happened in game 2 as well. Not really a great performance coming out from Canyon. It's been an up and down year, but let's not forget 2022 was an up and down year for Canyon as well, and everything ended up all fine when he went to Worlds, and then people got mad at me for saying that he was the second best jungler in the league. Well, look at him now. He might not even make an all-pro team, and so there's a lot of discussion surrounding DK, but Canyon getting a little bit more consistent, that's really the sweet sauce for them. Showmaker was fine, really didn't make a lot of mistakes, but was definitely out-pressured by Chovy. He was just better in this series, and so that's definitely a knock against Showmaker. And Kana actually had a lot of good plays on the Kennen. His flanks and his ultimates were really strong. Unfortunately, he just didn't have a team that was going to be willing to back him up on that. But his side lane pressure was honestly pretty impressive. One of the better parts of DK in this series, I would definitely say. Overall, DK not really in the position that you want them to be in. They are at threat of finishing the split in 4th place, which would be horrible for them. If KT Rolster is able to beat DRX in the final day of the season, then they will finish in 4th, which is disastrous. But I guess if you didn't want to finish in 4th, you shouldn't have slumped in the middle of the season. Either way, not really a huge difference between 3 and 4. It's really just bottom of the bracket side selection if you end up getting to losers, and so, you know, not really a huge difference, and I think DK has enough talent to be able to rebound from this, but it's always just going to be about consistency with this team, most specifically in the jungle. And then for Gen.G on the other side, I didn't really expect them to pick up this win. This team had been struggling in recent weeks, but I think they rebounded nicely. They are always a little bit of a surprise heading into playoffs. You never know if you're going to get the good Gen.G or the bad Gen.G, but my prediction is probably going to be the good one. I think Chovy is really good. I think Pays is honestly getting underrated. I don't know how that's possible, but Delight's been solid. Peanut's a really good player, and Doran's a good player. Gen.G is not a team that is a complete pushover. This team is much more similar to 2022 Gen.G than a lot of people realize, and let's not forget, that team kind of cruised to an LCK title last year. And kicking off our final day of the regular season here in the LCK, we have a ceremonial top of the table versus bottom of the table clash, as we saw T1 taking on NS RedForce. And T1 does pick up the win. No shenanigans here today. It's a little bit of a celebratory kind of mood for T1. Not only did they just lock in 17-1, a pretty damn good record. Not quite as good as they did in spring of last year, but I think you could argue that they are more dominant this split than they were in the spring of last year when they went undefeated. But also because it is the 10th anniversary of the GOAT. It's the 10th anniversary of Faker, and it's hard not to be excited about that. Faker is obviously the greatest League of Legends player of all time, and he gets to play some pretty wild picks in this series to commemorate. He gets the Kassadin, he gets the Lissandra, maybe not two of his most famous ones, but certainly ones that helped this T1 team win because they were dominant in this series. A part of me wanted to give Player of the Series to Faker just because, you know, it's the anniversary and you gotta do that. But that would be disingenuous to what this channel stands for in the first place, so we're not going to end up doing that. We're going to give it to the player that I genuinely did think was the most important to the team in this series, and that, of course, is KIA. It just continues to be KIA. It feels like every discussion surrounding T1 and every discussion surrounding the support role in general in 2023 is about KIA. That's really where we're at. He is consistently the best player on the planet in 2023, and I don't think you need me to tell you that. You've been hearing about it from pretty much everybody in the league sphere because it's just kind of the case right now. Usually when you have a player this unanimously loved, it's for a reason, and it's because he's not only changed the game, but when he gets to play the regular stuff that he was already super good at, we get reminded about that over and over again, and that's what happened in this series. KIA is getting player of the series. That Lux in game 1, the melee initiator Lux, is ridiculous. Don't play Lux like this in solo queue. Don't even try. You're not KIA. Your teammates are not T1. That copy pasta is perfect here. And dude, his Nami is just not fair. Lucian Nami is nerfed into the ground right now. It's not nearly as strong as it was a couple of weeks ago. I wouldn't say into the ground. It's still definitely playable, but I would argue it's one of the weaker bot lanes that's still consistently picked in the meta right now, and that does not seem to be the case for Guma and KIA because KIA bubbles are point and click. They're not as skill shot. Did you know that his client's actually a little different? That's why he never misses. That can be the only explanation for why I don't think I've ever seen him miss a bubble. It is actually absurd how well he plays this champion. I've talked about this on this channel before, earlier on in the year, where it's just like there's good Nami players and then there's KIA, right? That's kind of the case here, and he showed it off again in this series. Just a ridiculous amount of fun coming out from this T1 bot lane. A lot of people have been saying they feel bad for Gumayushi. I don't. Yeah, you maybe not getting the credit, but he's 17-1 right now in the LCK. I'd be feeling pretty damn good if I were him. I know that maybe he would want a chance as an AD carry to show off a bit more, but getting to play with KIA every day and not someone like Beryl maybe on DRX, right? That's a blessing in and of itself, and so feel good about T1, feel good about this bot lane. Faker was great, I don't want to take away credit from him. He was really good, especially in that game 1 on the Kassadin. Eventually he hit that level 16 breakpoint, where he was just really dominant, being able to take over the game. Owner, phenomenal. I mean, he's had a ridiculous year. I feel like I've talked about him less than he deserves on this channel. It's just kind of hard to find space when KIA and Faker are on this team, right? That Owner has maybe been the 3rd best player in the entire league, and probably the best jungler, and yet I've talked about him so little. Another phenomenal series from him. He gets a ridiculous stat line after this game. Zeus has been arguably the best top laner in the region. It's just, playing against T1 is unfair, and they showed why in this series. As for NS, you're the worst team in the league, and you were going up against T1. I think maybe you were hoping to maybe catch them off guard. Maybe they were trying to, you know, take it easy before playoffs. They didn't want to stress too much, but it didn't seem like they stressed at all in defeating NS in this one, and I hate to say it, but that was a little bit expected. My dud of the series is going to go to Call Me in the mid lane. For as good as he was in that first series, T1 is definitely a rough way to start your LCK career in your first week there. Obviously, it's not the first series he played, but it's really the first series where he got tested and he just was not able to go up against Faker in his 10th anniversary game. The Vigar, the Ahri, it didn't really matter what he was pulling out. It just wasn't clicking in the same way. He was probably the weakest member of Nongshim, but realistically, I mean, this could go to anybody. It certainly could go to Vital down in the bot lane, who felt like he really wasn't doing anything, just kind of got outplayed by Keria and Gumayushi. Peter wasn't exactly lighting the world on fire. It's really funny to watch Vital and Peter play the Lucianami, get destroyed by Caitlyn Lux, and then T1 take it the next game and absolutely obliterate them on it. Obviously, that's never a good sign, but that ended up happening. Sylvie, Din, nobody really had pressure on the side of Nongshim in this game, and again, that's okay. It's Nongshim versus T1. This team was never really supposed to be able to take games, but this is how your season ends, 2-16. I guess it could have been worse, but realistically, you're definitely looking for some improvement moving into the next split. I know that there are a lot of people out there talking about how Nongshim looked good over the back half of the year. They were competitive with teams, and while I do kind of agree with that, we've seen a lot of competitive teams, and if you don't win, it doesn't really matter if you're competitive. This team has never really been in a lot of spots where it felt like they could theoretically, like, reasonably beat teams in the LCK, and that's where you have to be in order to continue to improve. I don't know what the changes that they need to make are, but obviously, I don't think that this core group right now is the future for this team. But we'll see, obviously. You know, maybe spending the rest of the year figuring out what you want to do is the right call. As for T1, the best team in the league, the best team in the world. Like, what do you want me to say? This team is actually legitimately unfair to play against. Keria is the best player in the world. Faker is right up there with him. Owner is right up there with him. Zeus and Guma are right up there with him. You could make a real case that these are the 5 best players in the world, and I think you could also make a real case that this is the best regular season in LCK history. I know that record-wise, you know, you've had undefeated splits from T1 in the past, but I mean, from a sheer dominance standpoint, I can't remember a time where anybody in the LCK was this utterly destructive over everyone that they played against. This is a team that I'm going to remember for a long time, and it's really going to be up to them to capitalize and bring it home in the playoffs. And that brings us to our final series of the split here in the LCK in spring, and we go out more with a whimper than with a bang. We had KT Rolster taking on DRX, and KT Rolster gets the job done, securing themselves 3rd place in the LCK spring split. That's a great finish for them, and obviously they've looked really good over the second half of the split. I would argue they've looked better over the second half of the split than they did at the beginning. They were kind of inconsistent. You know, they had really high highs, but the lows were still kind of there. They very much felt like a streaky team that could lose to anybody, but could also beat anybody. Well, in the second half of the split, it's felt like it's gotten a lot more consistent from this team, and that's really all I ever asked of them, and that's why they've risen so much in my power rankings over the recent weeks. That's why I am very comfortable saying that they are a true contender to, at the very least, go to MSI, if not be one of the teams that, you know, tries to compete with T1 in the finals. And I really do think that KT has the talent to be able to go up against anybody. All these players have basically proven it to me at this point. My player of the series in this one, no shocker to anybody who watched the games, it's going to go to Keen in the top lane. Probably one of his more dominant performances of the year. I actually think he's quietly been very good for this team, very consistent. But again, like I said earlier in the week when it came to KT Rolster, top lane's just one of those roles in the meta right now where it doesn't particularly matter if you're good. Like, I don't mean that in a negative way, but if you're really good, like if you're Zeus good, you can take over top lane. You can win by massive amounts and you can create gigantic leads, but teams just aren't playing for top lane right now. Top lane tanks, weak side tanks, they're just kind of good. You know, Jace, Jax, those champions can kind of get away with being on their own quite a bit up in the top lane, and we're really not seeing a lot of teams invest a ton into that side of the map, and so, you know, because of that, there really aren't a lot of games that are decided by top laners, because we don't really get to that point. But when you do have a top laner that can break out and really have a couple of really good games, like, that's where it really starts to separate himself, and Keen had one of those in these. I especially think Game 2 was really good on the Cassante, definitely something worth pointing out. I think, generally speaking, he's just been fantastic for, like, what, 5 or 6 years in a row now. Obviously, was stuck with some of those crappy Afrika Freaks teams over the past, you know, 5 years or so, but eventually got out, got over here to KT Rolster, got some teammates around him, and now look at him. He's been an incredibly positive player for this team, and probably just had one of his best series of the year in the final series of the split, for the LCK, and that's really, really good stuff. Obviously, wasn't the only one. Aiming and Lehens are just so good as a bot lane. They've been ridiculously consistent. Now, they may have not had the same kind of highs as other bot lanes. This is me just kind of going into business for the long-term planning. A lot of people are going to say Aiming's the top 2, 3 bot laner. I'm real close. I feel like the top 5 AD carries in the LCK are definitely, they've separated themselves for sure. It's all the top 5 teams, all the top 6 teams minus Liiv SANDBOX, kind of have a really good AD carry right now. It's just really hard to get into the conversation of deciding who has been most valuable to their team. I'll have a big task ahead of me when I post my LCK awards tomorrow, but I do think that Aiming has been really good. Lehens has also helped him out a ton. I think Lehens is honestly not going to get the same kind of credit that he deserves from a lot of the audience. I know his stats aren't exactly up there, but he passes the eye test, and support stats are a little bit finicky anyways. It's really hard to get a good grasp on what exactly they mean, but these two are consistently ahead pretty much in every matchup they go into. They've been really solid for this team. They really don't cause any sort of mistakes, and they've been a lot of fun to watch. BDD's been great. He's taken a little bit of a step back, I would say, in the last week or so, but generally speaking, for the first 7 weeks of the season, he was an MVP front runner, and that's how good he has been over the course of the year, cuz I think is generally just going to go with the tide of what the rest of the team is doing. If the team is doing well, he's going to look pretty good. If the team's not doing well, he's not necessarily going to be the one to pull them out of the mud, but you'll take a player like that when you're surrounded by Keen and BDD and Aiming and Lehens. You've got plenty of talent on this team to be able to win games. You don't need Cuz to be able to, dominate every single matchup. But for DRX on the other side, unfortunate, this spring split is a disaster for them. Only winning 3 series when you were projected to be a top 5-ish team in the league going into the year is just not good. I mean, you're coming off of a world championship, for goodness sake. To be one of the worst teams in the LCK is just not acceptable. They have gotten a little bit better over the second half of the split, but going into a team like KT, it really just highlights how not close they actually are. They go for some cheese in game 2, they go for a base race to try and end the game, but they're just not able to pull it off, and outside of that, they really weren't competitive really at all. My dud of the series is going to go to Juhan in the jungle. Yes, I still think he's an upgrade to Krako. Krako was not really offering this team all that much, and I do think that the benching of him was well-deserved, and I do think that Juhan generally has been positive for this team, but, in a matchup like this, where you're going to be losing pressure early because your lanes are just not nearly as good, it can be kind of hard to play jungle, especially something like a Sejuani in game number 2, and he got absolutely punished for it. Some of those Wukong engages in game 1, no. Some of those Sejuani engages in game 2, no. And so, that's going to happen every once in a while. I think other candidates were definitely Rascal in the top lane, who just got brutalized by Keen in the 1v1 matchup, especially in that game 2. K'Sante and Najace is not supposed to go that much in favor of K'Sante, but it absolutely did. Do not get me wrong. It was dominant in favor of KT, and so definitely not great from the top side of DRX, but at the end of the day, there really wasn't a lot on the line for them here. They didn't really need to play up to, any sort of skill level. What's really important now is they figure out whatever the hell they want to do for summer. This team cannot afford to be trash 2 splits in a row. They are paying way too much money to these players in order to be that bad. This is a team that, at the very least, needs to contend for top 6. They cannot be near the bottom of the standings again. I do not know what that means in terms of fixing up this team, because there is talent here. They just don't work together really at all, and so I'm not exactly sure where you want to look for replacements, where you might need to get better in the future, but all I know is that this performance in spring is pretty unacceptable, and obviously the organization already knows that. As for KT, this team is now heading into playoffs with a lot of momentum. They've actually been really, really hot as of late. I really don't know if they're going to be a team that is going to dominate or if they're going to crumble under the pressure, but I'm sure I can speak for all of us when I say I am super excited to see this team play some best of 5s. All right, that is going to do it for my LCK Week 9 overview and analysis of all 10 series across all 5 days. Up on the screen right now, you're going to see the final standings in the LCK at the end of the regular season in the spring split. Of course, the top 6 teams are going to playoffs. T1 and Gen.G get their bye in round 1 because they finished as the top 2 teams. That means KT will be taking on Liiv SANDBOX, and Dplus KIA will be taking on Hanwha Life in the first round. Incredibly excited to preview all of that in tomorrow's video. You'll see there are question marks next to the power ranking section. I'll usually talk about my risers and fallers, but I'm saving all of that for tomorrow, not next week, for tomorrow's video, where I detail my thoughts on pretty much every single matchup and give my full playoff predictions. Hope you guys are excited for that, but I also do hope you guys enjoyed this video here. Of course, let me know down in the comment section what you guys liked about this video, and if you are excited about the LCK playoffs coming up soon. I know that there are a lot of interesting matchups. I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts and opinions, but Before we jump into the outro, time to talk about Player of the Week and Dud of the Week in week number 9. My Player of the Week, there was actually a bit of contention here with this one, but I ended up landing on Chovy for Gen.G being my Player of the Week here in week number 9. He just was really good across 2 very crucial series for this team, especially the DK series. You really needed to be able to pick up the win in that one in order to gain that first round bye, and he just went out and had some fantastic Yone games. He was really good early on in the week with the Cassante as well. It really felt, you know, like the right call to make Chovy my week 9 Player of the Week here in the LCK. And then my Dud of the Week is actually going to go to another team that, you know, it was relatively towards the top of the standings. My Dud of the Week is going to go to Canyon on DK. I just do not think he had a very good week. And this was a bad week to have a bad week, if you will. Playing T1, I'm willing to excuse it a little bit. Getting out jungled, it's going to happen. But that series against Gen.G, not particularly acceptable. He needed to show up. That was a super important series for their standings, and he just wasn't able to come up in the clutch. And so my week 9 Dud of the Week is going to go to Canyon. My week 9 Player of the Week is going to go to Chovy. But that's gonna do it. I really do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, hit that like button. It really does mean a lot to me. Helps get this video out to more people. And obviously with playoffs coming up, it's just the time to get this content out so that people can see the playoff predictions. We always put a lot of effort into those playoff videos, so I know you guys are excited for that. Of course, if you are new, hit that subscribe button. It really does mean a lot to me. Helps the channel. It helps this grow. It means we can put more production value into these videos. It's all around just a good thing. Not only do we cover the LCK on this channel, we cover all 4 of the major regions, as well as the NACL, and with playoff time rolling around for everybody, it is a good time to hit subscribe to get all your LoL esports information. But, of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.